Ja, guten Abend, meine Damen, meine Herren. Ich freue mich sehr, dass einige von Ihnen es heute auch in die Aula geschafft haben, zu unserem heutigen Abendvortrag in der Ringvorlesung Wissen schafft Wirklichkeit. Das Wetter ist heute nicht so toll in der Stadt, deswegen hoffe ich, dass ganz viele von Ihnen auch digital dazugeschaltet sind. Auch an Sie einen schönen guten Abend. Ich freue mich sehr, heute Abend Alex Usher begrüßen zu dürfen, der aus Kanada zu uns gekommen ist. Und er wird gleich noch ein bisschen intensiver von meinem Kollegen Peter Schreiner vorgestellt. Und ich freue mich aber deswegen auch sehr, dass wir ihn heute Abend begrüßen dürfen, denn das ist jetzt der zweite Vortrag in dieser Serie, in der wir den Blick von außen uns einholen, den Blick aus einer internationalen Perspektive uns holen auf den Hochschulsektor. Ganz konkret aber auch eben auf die Rolle von Universitäten und die Idee von Universitäten im Hochschulsektor. Wir haben vor 2 Wochen die Kollegin Christine Mousselin gehört, die uns etwas erzählt hat über den Bezug zwischen Universität und Staat im Vergleich von der Situation in Frankreich mit der Situation in Deutschland. Und heute, Alex Usher, you're going to take the wider view. So Christine Mousselin told us a little bit about the relationship between the state and the university in France in comparison to Germany. And I think your background enables you to take a much more global view and perhaps focus on some of the shared issues that at least underpin a lot of activity in Western countries these days regarding budget cuts and financial constraints for universities. So I'm very much looking forward to that. For us, this is a very timely topic here in Hessen. We signed our Hochschulpakt, the treaties with the state a few months ago, and this treaties means that we are currently in the process of reducing our staff by 10% over the course of the next 2 years, which for our university is quite a dramatic step and something most of my predecessors here never had to do during their years in office. So this is something which requires a lot of new ideas from us as a university community, but also some strength to handle the emotional side of this, because we all feel very strongly about what we do, but also to handle the side of how can we ensure that we still have trust in the institution and the people who run the institution, who shape the institution, because I think ultimately that will be the main power we can gather to stand our ground in our world. So I'm very much looking forward to your talk. Thank you so much for coming all this way. I just realized that I was introduced to you and your work by someone you never actually met, but he introduced me to your work at a point when he told me that it's very important for people who run a university to be good at storytelling. And you've written about that, and you've written about saga telling, I think. So I hope you've brought a little bit of a saga for us today, from which we can learn things and implement them in our everyday life. So thank you very much for making the trip. And now over to Peter Schreiner to introduce you a little bit more. Yeah.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, it is, of course, my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Mr. Alex Usher, the founder and president of Higher Education Strategy Associates, located in Toronto. Mr. Usher is an internationally recognized authority on student financial aid and quality measurement in post-secondary education. Over the course of his career, Mr. Usher has produced numerous influential studies that have shaped higher education policies not only in Canada, but across Asia, Europe, and even Africa. Mr. Usher previously served as the director of the Educational Policy Institute Canada, where he led major initiatives such as the Millennium Scholarship Foundation's landmark project on the long-term effectiveness of student aid. He's also well known for co-authoring a book with the title, The Price of Knowledge, which is widely regarded as Canada's definitive reference on student finance. His expertise has been sought globally Mr. Usher has authored UNESCO Europe's theme document for its decennial higher education meeting, 10 years back and 10 years forward, and he continues to contribute to the sector through his service on advisory, supervisory, and editorial boards across 4 continents. Before founding Higher Education Strategy Associates, Mr. Usher held senior roles at the Canada Millennium Scholarship Foundation, the Association of Universities and Colleges of Canada, and the Canadian Alliance of Student Associations. He's a graduate of McGill University and Carleton University. Mr. Usher's talk today, entitled "Does Familiarity Breed Contempt? The Rise of Universal Access and Falling Public Esteem for Universities across Europe and North America", die Vertrautheit als Nährboden für Geringschätzung, vom breiten Hochschulzugang zur sinkenden Wertschätzung von Universitäten in Europa und in Nordamerika. In his talk, Mr. Usher will enlighten us on the paradox that we're observing, namely that even though more people than ever pursue a university degree, public confidence in universities appears to be declining. One would have expected that the role of universities generally and the role they play in shaping societal progress would be congruent with the increasing number of university graduates. Apparently, it's not. Drawing on international comparisons, Mr. Usher will outline the underlying dynamics of this development by examining how shifting societal expectations, political pressures, and the consequences of mass higher education have created, indeed, new tensions in the relationship between the universities and the public. The lecture will discuss how universities can respond to these challenges, strengthen their credibility, and reaffirm their roles as institutions of knowledge, innovation, and social cohesion. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Usher.
Thank you very much. Meine Damen und Herren, thank you so much to Dr. Professor Lawrence for inviting me here today. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be here talking about this issue. I'm afraid I can't give this speech in German. It's been about 30 years since I've taken any classes in German, and I can get through a menu okay, but a speech might be a little difficult. I'm told you have an alternately good and hilarious AI translation system, so I'm hoping it's more good than hilarious. We'll see how that goes. Is everything okay with this? I think it's just rubbing up against my beard. So I'll just move it just a little bit and see how that goes. I think we're okay. Thank you. And so my presentation, when Dr. Professor Lawrence contacted me in the summer, I thought this was okay. This is an interesting challenge to say something that is both interesting and non-trivial about higher education. That's actually always a problem because it's there's a lot of truisms that have been around for, Gießen is 410 years old, around there. So we deal in the same kinds of truisms about higher education decade after decade. Burton Clark once made a famous remark that of the 100 or so institutions that have been around in Western Europe since the 13th century, 80% of them are universities, and that gives you a different view, a different perspective, and that's great. But it can also lead to some ossified thinking. So, being in a position, being asked to say something novel about the system is kind of interesting. But we're in very strange times. Universities are being questioned in ways that they have not been in quite some time. Next week, my company puts out a document called Year in Review. So we're starting an annual series of sort of almanacs of what's happened around the world, and we look at events in at least 25 countries, more in some cases. And what's striking to me about late 2025 is how many governments around the world are talking about universities as being not fit for purpose. It's particularly striking in Africa. Africa has all sorts of reasons not to need or want modern European or North American style universities. The economies are probably not meant for it, but it is striking the extent to which institutions, Senegal is the big one right now, are talking about radical overhauls of their university systems simply because you can't keep pushing out graduates from traditional disciplines and expect them to get the kind of jobs that the people who take these programs have been led to believe they deserve. And so, in keeping with the African theme here, I noticed a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, Jamil Salmi, who used to be the head of the World Bank's team on higher education, and he gave a speech a couple of weeks ago in Kigali, Rwanda, at the meeting of the International Association of Universities, and it was on a very similar topic. It was about loss of trust in universities. And he talked about a lot of things, but he singled out 3 areas in particular that I thought were useful to draw out. He talked about job market mismatches, right? That was a problem in many countries, that was eroding trust, that universities were promising one thing, but the kinds of programs that they offered, which are based, still on very traditional disciplines in some cases, were not meeting the moment. The second is the problem of underfunding, which leads to challenges on costs. In many parts of the world, when government does not put up funding, universities ask for tuition fees, or they ask for more international students, which is sort of the same thing in many places. And that has created difficulty, and it's created tensions with the publics that these universities are supposed to serve. And he talked about sustained elitism, which I think is important. I think that the very top levels of our somewhat stratified system, and Germany is probably not as bad as, well, there's no way you can be as bad as the UK, but we've provided students with access to university, but we haven't necessarily made the outcomes more socially fluid, let's put it this way. It's still the very top 1% of society that dominates the places at very top universities. And this is true in the United States, it's true in Japan, it's true in the United Kingdom, and that this also creates resentment because it means that universities are part of a system, and by no means the only part of the system, that is making social mobility seem out of reach. And he went on to talk about the kinds of things that higher education can do to fix these problems. And I thought that was a useful way to start the discussion, because the point I want to make today is that, in fact, all 3 of these areas are, at least to some extent, outcomes of the process of massification that we went through in mostly the 80s and 90s, depends a little bit where you are in the world. I think the higher education system made some very wrong assessments about what massification would look like and what massification would achieve. Like, to the extent that we were almost completely wrong about it. And what's interesting is we were wrong about it in many different languages, right? Like, academia made the same assumptions pretty much no matter where we were in the world about what massification would look like. And pretty much the same things went wrong with it everywhere. I also think we may have missed a step when we all moved to when we moved off the notion of massification, moved on to the notion of world-classness and world-class universities and excellence and all those kinds of things. And I think we've all hit some problems with the notion of the difficulty of creating genuine economic growth and the ensuing problems that has created for democracies pretty much everywhere, that we're struggling democracies now. That's all important. What I want to talk today about, though, I really want to focus on the politics of massification and how we got wrong the politics of massification, you know, and how that's changed the way that universities operate, and it's changed the context in which they operate. I will probably sound every once in a while as though I think massification was a bad idea. I don't. I'll put that up front. Massification was, in general, has been a pretty big success, no matter where it's been introduced. And where it hasn't been a success, I think it's self-correcting. We're seeing self-corrections now in places like Turkey, Iran, Pakistan. Sometimes you can go too far, and the returns are not there. And so there's a whole bunch of countries in that belt in Asia, from West Asia to South Asia, where there are countries that are just giving back the gains of massification. It's not entirely a demographic thing the way it has been in Russia, the way it has been in Korea. Students aren't going to university anymore. It's quite something. And so it can be self-correcting. But I think what we've missed is an ability to talk honestly about what the trade-offs of massification have been. And so tonight, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about those trade-offs. And that means, it does mean a reassessment of massification. We need to decide how much of massification, how much would we give back? If we knew all the troubles that massification would have started, how much would we give back? And which bits would we give back? What would we trade to get back the status quo ante? And that's just, normal democratic debate. We just have to have that kind of open debate. So let me start by talking about the history of massification. Obviously, there was a degree of massification after the Second World War, right? Every country had welfare states to support, had new governments to support. And by and large, those governments required people with humanities and social sciences degrees to manage these new, larger governments. And I think lots of people in humanities and social sciences thought that's the way it would always be, that they would always have the certain place that they had within the government. And then governments stopped growing, and that changed things. But at the same time, the need for scientists continued to increase, the demand for technologists continued to increase. And so particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, in Europe and in Canada, so Canada, I'm just trying to think here, we've doubled the number of students we've had in the last 30 years or so, less than that, 25. And that's better than most of Europe, but we have a growing population, so it's a little bit different. But, every country had that big doubling, or sometimes even more than doubling, at some point starting from the late 1980s and going on to the late 1990s. It worked differently, but the goal was the same. And the arguments were the same. It was that a knowledge economy, right? In the 1990s, we were starting to understand that the world wasn't always going to be about manufacturing, and the world wasn't always going to, the tertiary industries were going to be a big deal. I think it was 1992 when Robert Reich coined the term symbolic analyst, which I think was sort of the first time that we started talking about knowledge workers as being a different class of employee, right? A different, and indeed a different class politically as well. And there was a very hopeful idea. There was an acknowledgement that the system that we had was elite, and that it conferred a lot of benefits on the elites that received the education. And there was a very sincere and a very heartfelt belief that the benefits of that education needed to be extended to more people. It was an altruistic impulse. We want to give this great gift of university education to a greater portion of citizens. And we achieve that in different countries in different ways. In Germany, it was done through the extension almost entirely government funded, right? You didn't have tuition fees. I know you had that brief period about 15 years ago where people were experimenting with fees, and that's gone away. We've had systems of tuition fees with innovative types of loan systems, so Australia and New Zealand and the UK and America to a certain extent, we've gone through that. Sometimes we've done it just through fees, right? You look at Korea. Korea is tripled, quadrupled its system, and it did that entirely through tuition fees, right? Either in public or private or public institutions. So there wasn't one way to massify, right? Some places relied on public institutions, some a mix of public and private. Like there's lots of different ways to massify. Doesn't matter. We all end up in the same place. We all doubled or tripled our student numbers between the late 1990s and now. And by and large, we did it without reducing the graduate premium. Now, lots of people thought we couldn't do that, right? That the average graduate would still make more. They thought, well, as you expand the Economics 101, if you expand the number of people who get a good, then the price will go down. And so the price of graduates, that is their graduate salaries, will go down. And in fact, that didn't happen, right? University graduates still have a pretty big advantage over other types of graduates, more in some countries than in others, right? So I would say, again, a place like Sweden, for instance. Sweden is very, very low gradation in salaries. There's not much of a graduate premium, but they did it anyway. That's fine, because there's lots of benefits to post-secondary education, tertiary education, that are non-monetary. So it's still a great deal, right? So why do people dislike universities now? Why are they suspicious of institutions? We did this fantastic thing. Why do people turn on us? It's an interesting question. Let me go through Jamil's 3 suggestions, right? So his first suggestion was that part of it is about technological change and job market mismatch. Okay, maybe. I think technological change has arguably changed the world of work a lot more since the 1990s than it did between, say, 1945 and 1990, right? That there was, these things, right? The electronic revolution in particular has changed the way people work. It's changed the substance of work. And yet, if you look at universities and you say, how many departments do you have that are new since 1990? That's a smaller number, right? We tend to still view the world as universities through the lens of disciplines. Not always, right? I'm not being absolute about this. But I think there's a challenge here in that disciplines and universities made a bargain in the 18th century, right? And the idea was universities would give disciplines financial security, and disciplines would give universities intellectual heft. We didn't have to do that trade, right? But we did it, and it's continued to here. And I think one of the challenges here is that universities, by and large, as corporate entities, do not control their own curriculum, right? It is the disciplines themselves that do it, and that has benefits for rigor in particular. But if you're thinking about university as a platform that offers degrees to students, think about it in, I know this is not everybody likes doing this, but think about it from a consumer point of view. If the university is the supermarket, you want the supermarket to have products that are going to be useful for what you want. You don't want the same products year after year. There's not a lot of innovation there, and it's largely because of the disciplines. There's some other reasons, though. The first is that when we massified, the new students we got were not like the old students. And I don't just mean that in the sense that they were different generations. I mean, the top 20% of students from high school, which is about who we were getting in the 1990s, they're different from the next quintile. They're more likely to understand how to navigate institutions. They're more likely to be comfortable sitting in classrooms for long periods of time. And here's a really big one. They tend to see universities as places to explore futures. And the next level down, they don't see it that way. They're coming for a product. We did a fascinating study at my company once, and it was, and we asked the same questions to sort of students from different income quintiles. We were doing it on income quintiles, but the idea was basically if you were from a rich family or an upper middle class family, that's absolutely saw education. It was about exploration. It was about opening doors. But from poorer families, it was about closing doors. It was about saying, this is the career I want. This is the life that I want. Don't mess me around with all that other stuff. I'm just coming here to get this. And that's really interesting, right? Like, it tells you that students from different backgrounds do not have the same time horizon, right, when they think about how to benefit from education. And so what it means is that we've tended to have a much more vocationally oriented student body. We still have the same number of people who think in disciplinary terms and who think in longer terms, but the percentage has gone down because we've let in a whole new group of students who view the utility of higher education in a very different kind of way. And there's no winning with this one, right? Because if you're a university and you stick with your old method of giving courses, it's very disciplinary based, you disappoint the students who are coming in. And if you do change it, then you're often, within academic terms, you're seen as a sellout. You're seen as someone who's degrading the disciplines, right? So there's no winning this fight. It's a very real dilemma that every institution has. The students who come in are less ready to learn, on the whole. We've needed to find new ways to teach them, right? So how you teach to the class when you're dealing with the top 20% versus the top 40% can be quite different because the median, the middle person in that class, is quite a different kind of student. Some of them are less prepared in terms of being able to write. That's a problem AI, I think, is going to accentuate in the next little while. We have difficulty with those kinds of things. And in many parts of the world, we've taken 15 or 20 years to reverse engineer. Like, we just jumped into this idea, yeah, we'll double the number of students, but we're not going to offer a different set of support services to students. In my country, it's taken us 20 years to reverse engineer that and realize, oh, that was a mistake. And so we've added layers of services and layers of services, which professors don't always like because they've seen that as a competition for funds within the institution. But it's what it takes in order to get that group through. And the last point that's difficult here is, I don't think anybody really dealt with the truth that higher education is, at least to some extent, a positional good. That is, it's a good that gains some of its value from the fact that other people don't have it. I have it, you don't. I'm eligible for this job, you're not. And the problem with massification is if you go beyond what the positional good allows, right? Housing is a positional good. You know, everybody wants to live in the right neighborhood. You can make shelter a human right, but you can't make a human right. You can't make it a human right that everybody gets to live in the right neighborhoods. And that's kind of what's happened with higher education. We've promised people that they can get into the right neighborhoods, when in fact, there's only a limited number of places there. So we've overpromised, in effect, relative to what the job market can support. Again, this isn't true everywhere, right? And the extent to which it's true differs quite a bit from one place to another. But it is an issue in many places. So let's talk a little bit about underfunding and cost. When universities massified, and again, this is going to be different in different countries, but I will hazard this as a universal statement. I think everybody thought funding would increase. And that we'd get the same amount of money per student, you know, educating 40% of the student body as we did when we were educating 20% of the student body. That was rarely the case. In most cases, governments assumed that universities would give them some kind of, economy of scale. You'd get bigger. The cost per student would decline as institutions got larger. That's one reason. And the second reason, which I'll come back to a little bit later, is that growth has stalled. I mean, we assumed, again, when we were massifying, that we would stay in a world where economic growth would stay at 4%, 5% a year. We're at 1%, 2% a year, and we've been that way for a long time. Again, this is pretty much true across the developed world. We assumed a welfare state that would be much larger than the one we currently have. We've assumed the economies would be much larger than we already have. And so that has created pressures, and governments simply just don't pay for what we thought they should pay for. In many places, not Germany yet, those cost pressures have led to tuition increases, right? We've asked students to pay for it. And that makes students look at higher education differently. It makes parents look at higher education differently. They do look at it as a consumer good instead of, I'm not sure how you would present yourselves now, but probably not that way. And that's a real change. But even where that's not true, I mean, there's a statement it's easy in universities, as in welfare states, to throw money at problems. If you have a problem, here's some money, the problem goes away. The lack of cash going into the system, for all the reasons I just described, actually makes universities much more difficult to govern. It makes them much less likely to change, I would argue, particularly if they can't see a way how that change would result in any more money. Like you just sort of say to governments, if you're going to starve me, I'll starve doing what I've been doing for 20 years instead of starve trying to do something new. Right? That's a bit of a problem. The incentives matter. And I think that's kind of where we are, is that we don't have constituencies within institutions to change because nobody can see how they'll be better off after the change. You can invoke, as I think you're going to have to here, given the politics of the government of Hesse, you're just going to have to tell people you're going to have to live with it. You're going to have to live with 10% less or 8% less. I'm not sure what the exact number is here, but it's daunting. Okay, but that doesn't make people more likely to change, and therefore it doesn't make the institution look as though it's responding to the concerns of society. That's an issue. Let me come to the third issue that Jamil talked about, and that is sustained elitism in a stratified system. We increased access to higher education. That's the great success of massification. But we didn't increase access necessarily to the top institutions. And again, this gets back to higher education as a positional good. If I'm going to use an example like, the United Kingdom, the stratification at places like Oxford and Cambridge is kind of off the scale. The Sutton Trust does a good job showing this. What percentage of students at these institutions come from private high schools? Private secondary schools are a formidable thing in the UK. And you see the same kinds of arguments if you read the works of Raj Chetty in the United States. He makes the same argument about, the Ivy Leagues there. You can make a very similar argument in Japan about who gets to go to the 7 imperial universities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I come from a very, very lucky country. And I say lucky because we have a great policy solution that nobody came up. We just stumbled into this. And that is that we make our most prestigious institutions our biggest institutions. So in the United States, who gets to go to their top 3 universities? 0.1% of any given incoming class. In my country, UBC, University of Toronto, McGill, those are our top 3 institutions, take in 13% of the student body at the undergraduate level. So there's no bottleneck at the top. Actually, sorry, that's the one time I'm going to praise Canada here. I'm not in a habit of doing that, but on this, we stumbled into this solution, and I think it's really important because it means that at the very top, there's much less stratification than there is in other countries. I think one of the things that, Germany, I've never really bought the argument that there was no prestige hierarchy before rankings came in Germany. Like, there was always kind of people say that, but really there was one. But it was pretty flat, right? Like it's not a pyramid that looks like this the way it does in some countries. So I think Germany has been spared a lot of this. But in many countries, this is a big deal. The massified student body is clustered in the lower prestige institutions. And I don't think it's crazy for those students to feel like they've been sold a false bill of goods. Particularly where prestige institutions, which institution you went to really matters for what kind of job you get afterwards. This is a really hard one to change. The privileged classes will hang on to their ability to get into privileged institutions or privileged fields of study. You see this actually in the Scandinavian countries, actually. There's not a huge, they don't have big prestige, they have some prestige hierarchy, but it's really astonishing if you look at the social origin of doctors. That is at least as bad in Sweden as it is in North America. Right? It's all free. It's not about tuition fees. It's about how you monopolize these particular fields of study because they're prestigious. And it's very hard to get anybody to suggest something that would change that. I think I look at the arguments in France. France, which is a very open system, is not very open when you get to, again, places like medicine. And so whenever there are suggestions, we should go to a lottery system. At least it will reduce the chances that the very peak will dominate the system. The arguments against that, entirely self-serving from, again, the privileged classes, are immense. It's quite something to see the arguments against, against something that would, in theory, increase social mobility. So it's a problem there, and I'm not sure we have a great solution there. Now, before we go any further, let me just talk about two things. I just want to return to them. There are reasons that universities have lost prestige, which I think are not universities' fault. They're just things in the operating environment. One of them I already talked about, slow growth in the economy, right? It doesn't just affect money. It doesn't just affect issues of affordability. It affects people's belief in progress. People don't believe that investments in science lead to increases in living standards the way they did 3 decades ago. That's really changed. And it's because we've got a system, we pour lots of money in, and it's not resulting in growth. This has lots of other problems. It affects the way we think about democracy. It affects the way we think about social mobility. But just the environment that we're working in is much harder because of slow economic growth. The second thing that happened, I mentioned this at the beginning, was the move towards excellence and world-classness. There was lots that was positive about the arrival of rankings and the excellence initiatives. There are billions of dollars around the world that are spent on universities that would not have been spent on universities had governments not been embarrassed by the Shanghai rankings. In Germany, obviously, you've had, the Excellence Initiative was very much part of that movement, and that's great. But again, outside of China, it's not clear to me how well that money was spent. That doesn't mean we didn't do lots of good science as a result of it. It's just not clear that we did better science in the universities than we would have done outside them. And it's not clear that we've actually developed winners as a result. Now, China certainly has. But China's Excellence Initiative has lasted about 4 times as long as anybody else's has, and it's spent about 20 times as much money. It's a very different kind of investment than what we tend to see in the German Excellence Program or the Danish one or the French one or whatever it happens to be. And on top of that, so people are asking the question, does this money in science, does it actually lead to progress? Tie that to what happened during COVID, right? And again, COVID created difficulties around trust in science. There's more skepticism around science than there was. I'm not saying that's deserved in the least, but it's a factor. And so the question is really, people say, okay, I understand why you, a university, might want to be world-class. It helps you, think about your position vis-a-vis places in China. That doesn't matter to most people. Where, a university here ranks doesn't sell with most people. I mean, there's a general pride in science, right? But science exists outside the universities too. And you in Germany know this because you have one of the least university-centered systems of innovation of any country in Europe. So it's not clear to me how the world-classness helped. I think it may have hurt to the extent that people thought we were no longer interested in students. We're interested in research. We're not interested in students. The language of higher education changed a little bit in that decade after rankings, international rankings became important. So, I think those are other things which are a little bit outside the issue of massification that we need to think about. But let me come back now to the political issues of massification. One is the effect on society. I'll take the US and the UK as an example here. You had left-wing parties, it's a relative term, but you had left-wing parties become very serious about education. They wanted to own the education idea because it was a way of helping people from lower income backgrounds without actually giving them too much money, right? Without being seen as it being welfare. Education became the welfare program for everybody. And they said, we will help you go to school. That's what we're about, because schooling is really important. We want to help you go to school. But again, to use the US and the UK as an example, I think what the Make America Great Again movement, or the Reform Party in the UK, what that's telling you is there are a lot of people whose main concern is not whether they get to school, it's whether they can get a job that does not require school. They don't want to have to sit in classrooms. They didn't like it in secondary school, they don't want to keep doing it afterwards. So they want to try something, works with their hands. Again, Germany, and to a lesser extent Canada, I think have done better than the US and the UK in this, because we actually do have pathways to middle-class lives that are not absolutely dependent on being in universities, but in many countries, that's a problem. And I think it contributes to the notion that universities are talking down too much of to the population that doesn't go to university, right? That we're the standard, and everybody else is measured against that standard, and it's measured poorly against that standard. That politically is toxic, and you can really see how it's been playing out in the United States. It leads to polarization, right? I don't think this is true absolutely everywhere, and I think Germany is better insulated than many places, but I don't think there's anywhere that's completely free of this dynamic. I understand I don't follow German politics that closely, but I understand that the AfD has something of that issue, right? In particular, in that it tends to have its areas of strength in areas with poor levels of educational success, particularly in Eastern Germany. But here's the bit that I really don't think has been picked up by anybody, which is massification was a step towards universalization. And in my country, for instance, 80% of people who graduate from high school, I think it's getting close to 90% now, go to some kind of post-secondary education. That's mostly because a lot of the vocational stuff that you do at the secondary level, we do at the post-secondary level. That's part of what's going on there. But once tertiary education becomes universal or close to it, what differentiates it from secondary education? Like at a political level, you think about the management of it. What's the way that a government thinks about an education? Well, the other way I put it is, you start to become like a utility, right? Anytime a secondary school makes the news, it's usually bad news. The secondary school is supposed to be something that's there, it's supposed to be something that's reliable, it just does what it's supposed to do. It's like the water company or the power company. They just need to be always on. They don't need to cause trouble. And more to the point, nobody cares about having world-class water systems. They just have to work. They have to be reliable. Now think about, what we think about universities. Well, we're special. We do all these amazing things. And we do amazing things. I'm not disputing that. It's harder to argue that point if the main reason people want you to exist is just to be on all the time, to not cause any problems. Massification meant that universities were no longer special flowers. It meant we were like the power company. And just the way governments think about their job, I think it changes the way that they treat universities. We're just not that special anymore. So what can we do about all this? Well, there's no going back, right? Like, politically, it would be impossible to reduce the number of students university students we have now, because socially, that's what's seen as acceptable, right? People want that, parents want that, students want that. We just have to work better with what we have. And so I will give you 5 suggestions, none of which are short-term. So I know Ben was telling me earlier, he said, well, maybe you have some ideas that we can work with, because we're restructuring a little bit here now in Gießen, and okay, you could start some of these now, but they might take a while. So here's the 5 things that I would think about. The first is de-emphasize the disciplines. You're a university. You're supposed to deliver products that students want to learn. If those are not, draw on the disciplines. The disciplines have huge strengths that you want to draw on, but the list of programs that you offer does not need to be the same as the list of departments you have, right? There are ways of combining people with disciplinary strengths to do. Now, I think the new obsession is the wrong word, but the new affection for organizing universities around sustainable development goals is actually a pretty good idea. It's a pretty good start in that direction. I would love to see one university just say, we are only giving degrees in the 17 sustainable development goals, right? That would be fun, right? And I would draw a little bit of history and a little bit of physics and a little bit of chemistry, whatever. I mean, to work on each of those 17. Just say, we're not going to give degrees in history anymore. We're not going to give degrees in physics. These are, students' careers do not line up easily in most disciplines with a field of study. Let's just admit that and move on and figure out what the kind of education is that people want and what they need for their careers. The second, and this is something that I think feeds into the first one, is we need to make much better sense of changes in the labor market. And I think this is an area where North American institutions have got an advantage over most European ones. We spend a lot of time thinking about the labor market and what's going on, what is the nature of work, what is changing in the nature of work. And this, even for arts programs or social sciences, it's worth thinking about what are the transversal skills that are actually getting used by young graduates. How do we deliver? How do we shape our programs to make sure that they're getting those transversal skills? Lots of people say that's what they do. Like, humanities are really good at saying that's what, we help people think. Okay, I'm pretty sure all the other disciplines do that too, but that's an argument that gets made. But I think the question is, well, okay, how does thinking actually work in the workplace? What is it that bosses really want to see out of their new employees? And that's I could go on for a really long time about this, and I won't because I know I'm running out of time here. But that, I think, is really important. And you know what, importantly, that's not something that every institution has to do on their own. That's one where, I think if every council of rectors put up a division that just said, we're going to spend a couple million euros a year surveying employers about issues of skills and providing that data to all its members, that would be really good. That would be a huge step above where we are in most countries. The third thing, okay, this one really isn't going to happen, rethink the teaching-research balance. I think in many countries, the push towards excellence pushed universities further towards research than the public wanted. I think institutions often took advantage of the temporary panic that governments have. We don't have anyone in the top 100. We should drop a lot of money on all universities. And every university took that money and said, we're going to have excellence projects, for instance, or we're going to make all university professors do more research. I'm not sure that's actually what the public wants universities to be spending their time on, or at least not every university. There's some rethinking there about the teaching and research balance. And in some countries, not in Europe, we need to think about reducing the time to completion. Right. I really think that North America is about to see a wave of institutions pulling away from 4-year degrees and going towards 3-year degrees. And partly because Europe has shown the way and shown that it's possible. The fourth one, and it's related to the previous one, is research might need to be a little bit less about universities themselves. We made the argument that, under world-class universities, that research happens in universities. Great research happens in great universities. And the rationale was really that great American research happens in universities because we don't have any other arguments. And it always struck me as very odd that places like France and Germany took university rankings all that seriously to begin with, because it wasn't actually a comment on your science systems or your innovation systems, because you have Fraunhofer, you have Max Planck, you have, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, CNRS in France. I think there are questions that can be asked about what kinds of research needs to happen in universities and what kind does not. And that helps you make that, maybe helps you change the research-teaching balance a little bit. And the last one, and it's a point I made earlier, if we're serious about massification as aiding social mobility, we need to fight much harder to make the system socially mobile. And that means opening up that top 1 or 2% of places across the system in your top universities to people from lower income backgrounds. We're going to need lotteries. We're going to need systems that bring people who are not from the wealthiest families, who can give their kids all sorts of advantages, not just financial ones, but just the basics of knowing how to be an academic person, knowing the value, being able to speak in a room like this one. You know what I mean? There's a lot of non-cognitive, non-financial ways that the top tier of society manages to occupy all the top tier education spaces. And that means changing your secondary school system. I know this has been a live issue in Germany ever since the PISA survey started coming out 25 years ago, right? Germany has a pretty big gap in between the top students and the bottom students in secondary school. There's no way that's not carrying on into universities. You got to do something about that. We all have to. I mean, Germany is a particular case, but there's not a country in the world that does this well. Canada comes pretty close, but we're not perfect. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done in many, many countries to do that, because otherwise, I'm not sure the promise of massification is ever going to be realized. We will not be seen as a place where we're increasing people's life chances. We're actually being seen as somewhere that is making society less mobile. And that creates lower growth, and that creates lower innovation, and on and on and on. There's so many benefits, I think, to opening up the top tier in universities. And I really do think that that's maybe the most important thing that people can do right now in order to restore mobility and restore the promise of massification. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, we have to thank you for this very stimulating talk. It went by in no time for me, and you made a very deep and very detailed analysis on the various systems, what has been happening over the last 30 years. And we could probably be sitting here for many hours to discuss all these details, but I'm going to come over to kick us off maybe with a couple of questions and then ask the audience also to engage in the discussion. So in your 5 points, you mentioned point number 3, rethinking teaching and research balance. And you mentioned that Germany has this unique system of having also, Max Planck's and Fraunhofer's and all this stuff. So there are 2 thoughts that have crossed my mind, and they have crossed my mind a long time ago, is number 1, what if these institutions, these external institutions, would be integrated into the universities, simply to lift us up. We're basically spread thinly, and then in the Shanghai rating, those institutions could be integrated. If we did that, we've done that as a fun exercise, then would lift us up enormously. So that would be one option. Number 2, you are at an institution here that's named after Justus Liebig, and he was the one who introduced the unity of teaching and research. Back in his days, so he started out in the early 19th century, and when he started out, it was basically not looked upon well for proper academicians to do any lab work. lab being labor. Yeah? And he explored science through true, pure thinking. And Liebig said, no, we need to combine this. And you seem to be telling us maybe we need to rethink that as well. So maybe that starts us off.
So France is doing the first one, right? I mean, a lot of the CNRS labs are being integrated into universities with some success, I think. So yes, that's possibly one way to do it. I think what's different from Justus Liebig's time is the gap between the research frontier and where undergraduates live, if I can put it that way. Undergraduates in the early and mid-19th century would have been able to understand the frontiers of science, right? They were close enough to it that they could get there by the end of their undergraduate degree. I think that's true in a decreasing number of fields. If I'm in physics, man, like, being able to really understand what bosons do and how CERN works and all that kind of stuff, that's graduate level stuff. And so that unity of teaching and research certainly makes sense at the graduate level. It's not clear to me that it makes sense at the undergraduate level, or not in the same way. And I think to some extent, Germany's acknowledged that. That's why it's the difference that you have between universities and universities of applied sciences. So I think to some extent you've already done that, and you've done a better job of it than many countries. But when I talk about being more teaching oriented, again, I go back, someone asked me earlier, what do I think the most interesting systems are? And one of them is the Netherlands, and it's basically because their system of universities of applied sciences, the HABO's, is 2/3 of undergraduate enrollments. And that leaves 1/3 in the universities, and there's not a single university in the Netherlands which is not genuinely world-class. So in a sense, they've done what you've done, but have made the gap between Habo and university is a little bit different than between Hochschule and university here. Maybe we need to keep going in that direction. It's tough. It's tough to do because, as I said earlier, it's hard to take away the perceived privilege of universities from people. But again, over 30 or 40 years, it's possible. And I think China's doing it. That's the other thing to remember is China has been very successful. China's higher education is still growing, but nearly all the growth in the last 10 years has come in what they call vocational universities. So there are ways of keeping down the expansion of research-intensive spots, which I think is important for costs and for a number of other reasons.
A second question, the massification seems to be asymmetric. And when I say asymmetric, I mean that it was not massified to the same degree over all disciplines. Is that something I'm thinking, or is that something you have observed as well? I mean, I could rephrase it.
Which disciplines do you think were left behind?
The STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and math. Let's take math, and I think this has been an unlikely subject for massification, little pun in here. And indeed, math has not grown to the extent that other subjects have grown, and they've been, lots of new subjects that have sort of, taken over the numbers. Is there an asymmetry?
I think it really depends on the country, to be honest with you. So I look at it was certainly true in Canada. I think where I'm from, I think the division would not have been STEM, non-STEM. It would have been, if you will, pure versus applied. So humanities have gone down, but social sciences have gone up. And social sciences are sort of an applied humanities. STEM all our growth has been in STEM for the last 15 years. Arguably that's post-real massification in Canada, but it's important. So I think it does differ a little bit. It's certainly true that the non-STEM disciplines were cheaper to massify, right? But again, I would argue that this is the benefit of tuition fees. If students start moving towards one set of disciplines and you can charge them money for it, institutions have an incentive to move in that direction. And I would say Canadian ones have an incentive that maybe German ones don't in the same way. I'll give you an example. In Canada, what everyone says to me is, why is tuition rising? Don't most of your provinces have tuition freezes on? I'm like, yeah, they have freezes, but they're at different levels depending on the field of study. And students are voluntarily choosing to migrate into more expensive fields of study because they think those STEM programs, because that's where the cost is, will get them a better future. So again, if the policy framework matters a little bit here. But I can certainly see if a university doesn't get any more money for expanding a STEM spot than it does a humanities spot, then yeah, they're going to expand in, as you say, the non-STEM areas.
I think this is exactly what we've seen here, and you're making a good point that it's related to the cost per student to expand in that direction. So let's look into the audience, whether we have some questions from the audience. Yes, there is one over here. Microphone is coming your way.
Yeah, I'm Tom Kopp, Professor for Global Trade and Nutrition. Thank you very much for an interesting talk. And I think a lot of what you said gives me food for thought when I think about the teaching and about the students and how they are, and that's a very interesting perspective to how to look at them and how to look at them over the years and compared to my own studies. My question goes into something that you only mentioned on a by sentence. You said that similar developments that you explained for massification at universities can be said about the pursuit for economic growth and its effect on democracy. Mm-hmm. I suppose that will have also something to do with disappointed expectations or something like that. And yeah, maybe you can say a word or two about that.
So the comparison I was making was just in democracies as in universities. If you have more money, it's a lot easier to make it run. Or I guess the ability to borrow money in Germany's case. If change is hard. Change is hard no matter where you are. And in public services where there is a lot of inertia, if I can put it that way, it's hard to make the case for change. And it's hard to make the case for change because, for the same reason as in democracy, it's like trade, right? Changes tend to have lots of winners, but a few big losers, right? And so it's the same argument about free trade and why free trade is never popular. Free trade is great. It's very unpopular because it has a few very concentrated losers, and that's usually the case in academic reform as well. And so that's really the only point that I was making there is if we had more money, there would be ways to grease the wheels, to make things happen, to reward people who were prepared to take on short-term pain for long-term gain. But I wouldn't push the metaphor any further than that.
Further questions from the audience? Follow on.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex. So I was thinking about what you said about disciplines and the sort of the relationship between the institution, the university, and the disciplines. And it reminded me a little bit of something we heard 2 weeks ago when Christine Mousselin was talking to us, and she sort of made a difference between the German system and the French system in the way in which the French system has this direct link between the disciplines and the ministries. So the ministry communicates directly with the faculties, and in Germany we have the sort of kind of the intermediate sort of kind of moderator level of university leadership. And I was wondering to what extent, I mean, I take your point about students might want to be taught things that are more related to challenges in the workplace. But I was wondering about on what basis do they actually choose their course? Is it not to a certain extent also by some assumption about a discipline and the sort of the value embedded in that discipline? Based on what you just said about sort of, I don't know, you said something about medicine degrees being perceived as a particular way into the top tier, the sort of the nice areas to live. And law might be another area like this. So at the end of the day, students might be buying into disciplines more than they might be buying into, I don't know, solving climate change or producing growth in a country where there's sort of kind of economic struggles. I mean, is there a way of sort of kind of separating this out, or are we stuck with other disciplines and universities in a way because they are sort of like gatekeepers for aspirations?
I think it's hard to tease out because you can't compare the two, right? We're always in a system where you're doing one, and we're all doing it based on disciplines. And I think of course they're doing it on what they know about disciplines, right? And disciplines have certain auras, you know. So a sociologist is a certain type of person, wears a certain type of jacket. You know, and the engineers don't look that way, right? And so there's a kind of an aura, and that's what they're buying on. I think the United States is the place right now to look at how disciplines versus challenges are going, because you do get a lot of universities right now. There's a big story in the Wall Street Journal last week, about Montclair State University. Don't ask me where that is, because I forgot. But they have really pushed a new type of degree, you know, where all the degrees are separated from the departments. They basically eliminated departments. And there's a number of institutions that have tried that kind of thing. They don't work very well, but this one is a particularly, and you know, the English professors are absolutely outraged. How could you do this? This is a you know, desecration of knowledge. It's like, no, it's a desecration of lining up administrative power with disciplinary identity. Right? People are still taking English classes. The English professors are all still employed. They're just for students getting degrees in things like persuasion or, you know, whatever it happens to be. They name them differently. And so I think increasingly in the United States, you will see students starting to, a growing proportion of students will be in those kinds of programs rather than disciplinary programs. And that's already started in the United States. It'd be interesting to see how it plays out over the next little while. I suspect, however, that in most countries, most times, most places, the only way that's going to happen is if a government sets up a new university to deliver those kinds of degrees. I think it's very, very difficult for an existing university to sort of turn itself on its side. Again, it's just the problem of inertia. And so one might imagine that universities are in for a set of reforms like France had in the late 18th century, right? In the Revolutionary War, when people said, universities don't serve the public. We need these new polytechniques, we need the École des Mines, we need, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But for that to happen, government has to say, I'm setting up a new university on a new model, and they're going to try it. And if it works, others will adopt it. But you need someone to set it up with a particular mandate. I don't think many governments are going to do that, but as long as a few do, we'll get to see the results of the experiment.
Other questions? Let me ask you one in between here. Maybe somebody has another question in a moment. You said massification can't be turned back. It happened. I was thinking, wasn't it also inevitable? In the sense that the world is becoming more complex, more technological, and isn't it a requirement that to survive really with a large number of people, that everybody has to be brought up to a higher level of education? Yes. So isn't it inevitable that we had the massification?
Yes. I think the question that some people might ask is, do you need the degree of massification that we have? Does it need to have all have been in universities? Or would it, in the Dutch case, could you have put more of it into a different tier of institutions? One that's granting bachelor's degrees, but maybe not quite the same kind of bachelor's degree, right? So, I think that's where a lot of the nuance is. I think we've seen, again, those examples I gave you, Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, I think we see examples of overdoing the massification. It is possible to overdo the massification. I mean, compared to those countries, like Turkey went from 2 million students to 7 million students in 13 years. Like, that's wild. So there's no, I mean, within the EU, I don't think there was any country that ever went quite that fast. Maybe Poland or Romania right after 1989, you might have seen some of that kind of growth. But there are certainly limits to the massification, and I think most EU governments handled it pretty well. It was strong and steady, and it wasn't. And you thought about it. I mean, you think about the Pact for Growth here in Germany. That was a big sum of money, but it wasn't a crazy sum of money, and it was meant to grow, but not, expand pell-mell. So, I think mostly it was handled responsibly by countries. But that doesn't mean that the trade-offs weren't inevitable anyway. So I agree with you. It wasn't simply about helping, students. It was about helping students get extra benefits. The benefits had to be there, and part of the benefit was to serve a growing technological, knowledge-based economy. And yet, we still have these trade-offs.
All right, I'm looking around and see, maybe there's another question.
One last one.
Maybe the last one, because we worked our guest very hard.
Thank you very much. I agree to so many things you were saying. Thank you so much. But there is one thing, if I'm looking at the German higher education system, I think our system, and one strength has been that we were less stratified in comparison to other higher education systems. I don't know any other system which was that less stratified as Germany. And I think another thing you're arguing very much from the labor market, and I get the point, and if we are talking about massification, people expect to enter to the labor market easily and get a position equivalent to their degree. But coming back to the idea, what was meant when we built up our education system, including the school system and the higher education system after the Second World War, was to educate people who are independent from any influence from the politics, from the economic, but just by themselves. And I'm sure you know this argument, but I'm still thinking, if we go the path we are very depending on the public funding, but we are not that much depending on the economic funding. If we go that path, I guess we're losing some of the idea we built up after the Second World War to be independent, having critical people and spread it all over the society. And that's why I think it's another idea of massification that you are arguing.
Yes. I think I agree with you, and I'm debating how far on a limb to go about a system I don't understand that well. So, I think that's true. It's an interesting combination that Germany has, isn't it, right? Like, it has a very stratified secondary school output, as we've seen in all these PISA results, and yet a very non-stratified higher education system. That's an interesting combination. And again, look, I said at the outset, I'm trying to give a general tendency across many countries, and there's always exceptions, and it's going to look different and all those kinds of things. And I do think that Germany is exceptional and does not have the kind of problems that you see in the UK and the US, right? Because that's one model. I don't think the problem is anywhere near as acute here as it is elsewhere. But I think that same issue about whether students feel like they're getting what they were promised is an issue. I suspect that's an issue here. And I don't think that the reason that they're not getting what they were promised is necessarily university's fault. They were promised better incomes than their parents. well, it's not university's fault that growth is anemic. Well, it's not, might have a little bit something to do with it, but it's not primarily university's fault. You know, it's not, I think where massification enters into it is where people said, well, my parents got to be in the top quintile because they went to university. And I might not get that because more students are there. The degree's not worth as much. And they don't mean that in the sense of, is there a gap between, you know, university, people who go to university and who don't go to university. They're saying it's still not as special. There's no way to, I'm still not in the best neighborhood, right? Because the number of people with degrees is larger. And and I think universities have been slow to own that. They don't want to admit that that's, yes, part of the deal is that we're still elite institutions, but you're not going to be elite. You're not necessarily going to become elite just because you come here. I think that's, so even in a system like Germany, which has, I think, to a greater degree than other countries, avoided the stratification problem, that's still an expectation problem that you have with your whole student body.
I suppose these were the final remarks.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
So,
the weather's terrible out, so thank you all for coming.
So let's thank Alex Usher again for his excellent stimulation in rethinking the university systems. And also before you leave, also those that are online, let me remind you that there will be another lecture on December 15th by Professor Dr. Wolfgang Beil. Lernen sichtbar machen, ein Impuls für universitäre Lehre. That'll be the last one this year, and it continues then in the next year in the old format. Have a nice evening.